31st of this year. My question, what steps is the insurance minister taking to ensure that other important volunteers, community-based agencies know that the province is prepared to step forward and compensate them for their exposure to liability?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I do not know what the program is that Community Services, I believe the honourable member is telling me, funded for insurance. There are no plans at the present time to, as far as I know, to extend that to other departments.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dozens of volunteer fire departments have been notified that their insurance with Sun and Royal Life Assurance will not be renewed. Group homes, food banks, transition homes, and women's centres are some of the other important community agencies that are struggling with sudden increases in the cost of commercial liability insurance. The order in Council, approved on April the 4th, is the first concrete action this government has taken to lower insurance costs. Mr. Speaker, and I will table that to in the House. And my question will be, will the minister ensure or the Premier tell Nova Scotians when the government will give similar relief from unacceptable insurance costs to fire department and other important agency groups?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I can talk about the Fire Marshal's office, because the Fire Marshal office at the present time, in fact, I think just yesterday was speaking to the volunteer fire departments with regard to insurance for those particular departments that have lost their insurance. With regard to the community services, Madam Speaker, I would ask the Honourable Minister of Community Services to take
Sufficient. The Honourable member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Skyrocket Insurance knows that Nova Scotians are very concerned about this issue. Very concerned. I thought the government would want everyone to know that the Conservatives have taken one step to start helping people to escape the burden of insurance costs. The government should not limit its relief from skyrocketing insurance costs to one set of agencies, one form of insurance, or one calendar year. Why won't this government extend the relief from commercial insurance costs far more widely? That's my question, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to refer that question to the Minister of Community Services.
Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite refers to an OIC that was passed earlier in this month. But, Mr. Speaker, I would like to assure the member opposite that it is not only citizens in Nova Scotia, but also the government of this Nova Scotia that is having its difficulties with insurance companies. And the reason the OIC was passed is because the insurance industries are tightening their criteria to extend coverage. And in fact, this is an interim measure to cover children's aid societies from liability insurance.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question, Minister of Health Promotion. Mr. Speaker, in listening to the throne speech, there was a reference to initiatives that would be implemented in the Office of Health Promotion. But those are all past initiatives. There are no new initiatives and no plan for that office. And what the minister needs to understand, Mr. Speaker, is that health promotion is much broader than just fitness. Health promotion requires effective strategies, target specific groups, and is supported by public policy that addresses chronic illnesses, for instance, among many other things. My question to the minister, can this minister explain what concrete new initiatives his office plans to implement to be effectively use the health promotion strategies to create better health care for all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. And, Mr. Speaker, one such indication of that I can point to directly, Mr. Speaker, is that of the chronic disease prevention strategy, which we'll release this fall.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a start, and we look forward to the fall when it will be implemented maybe in the future. The idea of impression and these types of promises is really what we've been receiving. In reading the throne speech, there was a three-sentence paragraph devoted to health promotion, just three sentences. Significant stress was placed on fitness, but again, not on chronic disease prevention. So maybe the minister is listening. There's little value in establishing these types of programs without adequate resources. And this office has not been resourced to deal with chronic disease prevention strategy. My question to the minister: will the minister provide an outline of the plans he has to build comprehensive policies and strategies that address the long-term health care, particularly in the chronic illness field?
Minister of Health Promotion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that probably no one in this House, other than perhaps the Premier, is aware, Mr. Speaker, of the importance of putting an appropriate strategy in place to deal with chronic disease. And, Mr. Speaker, what the stakeholders have told us very clearly is that they want a long-range plan, and they want that done with the appropriate consultation. They want that done with the appropriate planning. They don't want a one-year strategy or a two-year strategy. They want a long-term strategy, and that is what we are doing with the chronic disease prevention strategy through Dalhousie University, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on your final supplementary.
Speaker, I thank the minister, but I hope the long-term strategy for long-term illness doesn't take an unduly long term. But, Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, the minister appointed Scott Logan as the office's new executive director, and he's a distinguished athlete and is most competent administrator. And at the time, the minister stated that the work of this new office would be crucial to helping improve the health of Nova Scotians. My question to the minister: would the minister please outline for the members of this House today exactly what Mr. Logan's responsibilities will include and what he will be allowed to do with all the many talents that he brings to that office?
The honourable Minister of Health Promotion.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly provide the member, Mr. Speaker, with an overview of the position that Mr. Logan has, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the member can also read our business plan, Mr. Speaker, for the upcoming year to see what the Office of Health Promotion will be doing, some of the activities.
The honourable member for Cape Breton and the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Mr. Speaker, roads are currently in a condition of distress throughout rural Nova Scotia, including streets in Cape Breton and the Lakes. Potholes appear nearly the size of manholes in city streets. My question to the Minister: can the Minister indicate what the newly signed agreement between the federal government and this government, what that agreement will mean for rural areas not included, like Cape Breton, not included in the deal?
Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the honourable member's interest in the riding, the Cape Breton, the lakes, and the roads in that. And the roads in the Cape Bretons, the lakes, I'm sure are like the roads all over Nova Scotia. That's been a very, very, very difficult winter, and of course that some of the work that might have happened to the repair of those roads has been delayed over the last number of weeks as a result of the heavy rainfall. But I can assure the honourable member that the government is committed to repairing roads all across Nova Scotia. And point of fact, the government of Nova Scotia was pleased to increase the capital budget of the Department of Transportation to almost twice as high as it was under the former administration.
The honourable member for Cape Breton and the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Village Drive, Church Road, Outer Point, Little Pond, Millville, Route 223. I can go on and on. Coxie, Westmount, Mr. Speaker, Groves Point. The list is just endless, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind the minister that since 1999, I feel, as well as the residents of my constituency, that this government is neglecting the maintenance on these streets, not just in the past few weeks. My question to the minister is, now that the funding agreements are signed with the federal government, can the minister indicate how this will impact on new paving projects throughout rural Nova Scotia, similar to Cape Breton, the lakes, areas not affected nor benefiting from these federal dollars?
The honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much. And as the honourable member indicated, the roads in question are not part of the national highway system, but I can assure the honourable member that we are committed to the rural roads in Nova Scotia. We are the government that created the RIM program. We are the government who increased capital spending in the Department of Transportation. We are the government who increased the maintenance budget of the Department of Transportation, and we're the department that will going to fix the roads in Cape Breton, the lakes, and all across Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Cape Breton and the Lakes on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My final supplementary is also to the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Mr. Speaker, bridges are another topic, another major issue facing Nova Scotians. In the spring of 2000, the previous minister closed a bridge in my constituency located on Queen Street, adjacent to Cape Breton North, leading into the town of North Sydney. This route, Mr. Speaker, is a listed economic route for the town of North Sydney because of its close proximity to Trans-Canada Highway 105. Now, Mr. Speaker, last year, the previous minister made that commitment that this structure will, after 2 years, this structure would be replaced this spring. Will this minister fulfill this commitment?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to report to the honourable member that the honourable member for Cape Breton North has also brought the same bridge to my attention, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker had brought it to my attention long before today, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that we're looking at that bridge as one of our priorities in the near future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday evening, the member from Chester St. Margaret's and myself attended an important meeting at Sir John A. Macdonald High School. Needless to say, there is some deep distrust of the intentions of the Department of Education. The current school is unable to deliver the basics of the PSP. The previous minister gave a commitment that Sir John A. would be as good as a new school. Will you renew that commitment, Minister of Education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member Timberley Prospect on your first supplementary. You have about 8 seconds.
Will you tour Sir John A. Macdonald High School with the member from Chester St. Margaret's and myself?
The Honourable Minister of Education. Unfortunately, time allotted for question period has expired. The order, please. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture on introduction. No. Okay. We reached the end of question period. We are now into opposition members' business. The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you call resolution number 26, please?
Resolution number 26. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise today and to speak on the resolution number 26. Speaker, I'll read the operative clause that says, therefore be it resolved that the Premier reflect on what he has said.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber. The Honourable Member for Richmond has the floor.
Speaker, I'll just read the operative clause where it says, therefore be it resolved that the Premier reflect on what he has said and tell the people of Nova Scotia why he has failed so miserably to live up to his word. Mr. Speaker, what we have seen in the last 4 years from this government has been a government of broken promises. What they have done and they have undertaken to do in the last number of months is to undertake an unprecedented PR campaign to try to convince Nova Scotians that they have done what they set out to do, to try to spin to Nova Scotians politically some key messages that they want to get out and try to hide and avoid the real issues of where the Premier made commitments that he has failed to keep to the people of Nova Scotia. Speaker, we've heard questions today asking about the Premier and his PR campaign. Speaker, I can tell you I, like yourself, sat here as a member of a minority government, sat here in this chamber when we listened to the Premier lecture the previous government and preach as to how taxpayers' money should not be used for political advertising. Yet we watched the very same Premier on the eve of an election start publicizing documents that make reference to the Blue Book numerous occasions, a book which we all know is part of a Tory platform, not part of a government platform or a Nova Scotia platform. Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, we saw our party has been consistent. My predecessor before me, the Honourable Don Down, and myself have continued to point out the issues surrounding the debt of this province and how it's important to get control of that debt. This was a Premier that in 1999 said repeatedly, both in the Blue Book and in speeches, that his government would not allow the debt to grow. So, Speaker, we have the famous quote from him when he introduced the budget in 2001 where he said, as soon as we table this budget, the debt will not grow from here on forward. Speaker, those are the Premier's words. They're not mine, not the Minister of Finances, they're not anyone else in his government. They are those of the Premier. the same Premier whose face is pictured on the Blue Book. It is he who gave his commitment to Nova Scotians that he would not mortgage the future of its children or grandchildren. Yet, Mr. Speaker, now we have a Minister of Finance and a Premier who stand in this House and say, we have borrowed, we are still borrowing, and by God, we're going to continue to borrow, and we offer no apologies. Well, I say to them, Mr. Speaker, shame on them. Shame on the Minister of Finance that as he leaves office, leaves a legacy of continued borrowing, a legacy that he learned quite well during the Buchanan days when he sat as a minister of a government that nearly bankrupted this very province. And to now hear him say that he has no apologies for continuing to borrow. How convenient, Mr. Speaker, that they've been able to change the accounting principles and they now say that under GAAP that it's all right. As long as you balance the budget, it doesn't make a difference how much you add to the debt. Somebody else will take care of that problem. Somebody else will take care of the problem is the message that he is giving. Today, we're on the eve of an election. We want to make sure that we get re-elected, so forget about the debt. Even the Premier's now got, briefing notes coming to him. Advice to Premier, privileged and confidential from Rob Batterson, trying to find key messages for the Premier to give to avoid having to admit that he's broken his commitment that he made to Nova Scotians to not increase the debt. Yet have they increased it just by a little bit, Mr. Speaker? No. $521 million, and they now say in this budget they want to increase it by another $118 million. That is how much they want to increase the debt of this province. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the reality is the Minister of Finance is very quick to refer back to 1999 and refer to the previous administration. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that from 1999 to today, that Minister of Finance had an additional $1 billion of revenue to invest in Nova Scotia from what was there in 1999. Yet, even after $1 billion, he is still borrowing $118 million onto the debt of this province. Mr. Speaker, this is a government that came in and said that they would have their own school capital construction program. What a great plan they would have. And yet today, what did we learn, Mr. Speaker? After 4 years, today the Department of Education, when they were asked to table the Tories' capital school construction plan, the bureaucrats had to say, we're sorry, we have no plan to table. Mr. Premier, you gave your word. You gave your word that you would have such a plan. You gave your word that Nova Scotia students, communities, teachers, and school boards would clearly know what schools your government intended to build, to replace, and repair. Yet today, 4 years later, the Department of Education officials had to say, we're sorry, we have no plan to table. Once again, Mr. Speaker, a broken promise from this government. More importantly, a broken promise from this Premier. How sad it is to see, Mr. Speaker, the Premier, when even the embarrassment of his own memo from one of his primary political spinners in trying to tell him what messages to give to avoid accepting the fact that he has broken his word to Nova Scotians. The Premier tells the media that he was not embarrassed by that. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that if he was not embarrassed, that Nova Scotians are certainly disappointed. Disappointed to see that a Premier that in 1999 made so many commitments and said, trust me, I'm a family physician, trust me, I will provide you with honest government, open and accountable government, I will respect Nova Scotians. How sad to see that today the Premier goes home to bed at night and tries to memorize the briefing notes from Mr. Batterson and others rather than providing Nova Scotians with the honesty and with the open and accountable government that he said he'd give in 1999. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, having gone back to my riding last weekend, having spoken to Nova Scotians, the shine is coming off the Premier, the veil is being lifted, and the mask is coming off. And Nova Scotians are now seeing truly what the priorities of this Premier is. And the priorities are not good government, Mr. Speaker. The priorities are to get the Tory party re-elected. And the Premier has clearly been given the marching orders from the Tory brass. It's put aside these commitments you've made, put aside the personal integrity you committed to Nova Scotians, and make sure that this party gets re-elected. That's your number one objective. And more when we see the Premier stand up and start to recite the words of Mr. Batterson, start to recite the verbal diarrhea that we have here and in so many other memos, Mr. Speaker, at that point.
I
I think verbal diarrhea is an unparliamentary term, and I think the member should retract that.
Well, that's news to me, but sure, as Speaker, if you say so, I will retract that. But the political spin that we see continually coming, and more, you know, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you that watching the Premier in the news scrum yesterday with the media there, knowing that the media had been given a copy of the Premier's this advice memo that came from Mr. Batterson, the media had it in their hands, and how amusing it was to watch that when they asked the questions contained in here to the Premier, he recited pretty much word for word what was here in this advice memo. What a shame, I have to say, Mr. Premier. What a shame to see today that a Premier that lectured the previous government, that preached to Nova Scotians, that said what a higher standard he would bring to public office, to now see that he's been resorting to nothing more than memorizing this political spin documents from Mr. Batterson and from others. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are seeing right through it. And they're seeing what we've been telling them all along. They're seeing the real face that is coming behind this government. They're seeing the real face that we have a Premier here that has been able to set aside the commitments that he has made in the past, who's unwilling to admit that he has been unable to keep them. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, go home into your own riding and ask your own constituents, do you have better health care under John Ham? Do you have better roads under John Ham? No. Do you have a better community? I can tell you what the answer is. Mr. Speaker. And if the Premier, it's unfortunate the Premier did not accept my challenge when he came to Richmond County on Saturday to drive on some of the key roads throughout our county. I can certainly guarantee you he would not be sitting back in his chair today and saying yes, that the roads have improved when he sees what he drove through in Richmond County. Mr. Speaker, it is a shame because when one looks at how much this government has taxed Nova Scotians, I was amazed to see that 2-cent increase in gas tax. Now, 2 cents doesn't sound like much. $25 million additional revenue brought in by that 2 cents. Yet, Mr. Speaker, where is that money gone? Even with that $25 million additional funds, the minister says I have to go borrow $118 million to try to show that we are going to do something about roads here in this province. Mr. Speaker, that is extremely unfortunate. I want to say again, Mr. Speaker, I know the issue was raised today, and I can tell you I can't wait to go campaigning on the issue of who gets the $155 check and who doesn't. Because I can't wait to go see into the seniors' homes. I can't wait to go see in those who are disabled. I can't wait to go see the single mother with a couple of children. I can't wait to see minimum wage earners and say the Tory government under this Premier feels you're not good enough and you're not worthy of getting this rebate back. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the Tory government wants them to pay higher gas tax, wants them to pay higher home heating fuel, wants them to pay higher insurance rates and all the other user fees. But no, the Minister of Finance says you haven't contributed to the economy, so you don't get the check. You're not good enough to get the check under the Premier's vision. What you are seeing, Mr. Speaker, is another example of the right-wing agenda of this government. As I said before, the veil is being lifted, and it's not very pretty of what we're seeing under that veil when it comes to the Premier of this province. And I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, as the budget debate goes on, as this House continues, it's only going to get worse, because we are going to see the manipulation of the numbers, how they've been dressed up to try to convince Nova Scotians they've got good government, how they are going to continue with the PR campaign that they have undertaken to use taxpayers' dollars to try to convince Nova Scotians and spin that they have gotten good government, rather than this Premier simply saying, I don't need a PR campaign, I don't need spin doctors, I am going to provide good government and stand by my record. That's what Nova Scotians thought they were getting in 1999. They really did. They're fooled. That's what the Premier said he would give them in 1999. I will hold my commitments. I don't need politically paid advertising. I'll defend my record. I'll stand by my record. How sad it is to see today, Mr. Speaker, that all of that has gone by the wayside. That now the Tory brass has told the Premier, stand aside. Forget about those commitments. Let us take over. This government is failing. This government hasn't met its commitments. We need a new strategy. We need the glossy brochures. We need the radio ads. We need to be sending out all the messages we can to convince Nova Scotians that they've gotten good government. This is not something new. We tabled last session a report that came in where bureaucrats were told, you need to go out and sell the successes of this government. Yet, there was only one problem. It said, you have to give the appearance of successes of this government. You have to try to convince they've been able to do this. And you have to try to convince that they've done well here. Rather than say, here's the record here. Here's the facts. This is what you're to rely on. It was spin. All about political spin. And today we even heard again during question period, this government, the government of this premier, is more interested in bringing into this province spin doctors than medical doctors. And shame on the premier for that. A premier who said he would fix health care, with a minister of health who admitted yesterday, I wish I could have the entire budget of the province to put in health care. Is that a premier who's fixed health care? When his own minister says she would like to have $5 billion to put in the system because the system's out of control and it hasn't been fixed? There was your clear admission, Mr. Premier, one of your own senior ministers saying, we have no plan for health care. We wish we could throw the whole budget at it, and even at then it wouldn't be fixed. That's very sad, Mr. Speaker, because Nova Scotians in 1999 thought they were getting better than this. They really thought the Premier would hold to his word, that the Premier could stand up and defend his own record, wouldn't need the spin doctors, wouldn't need the glossy brochures, wouldn't need to be reciting Rob Batterson's advice to Premier memos at night before he goes to bed, and then reciting those word for word to Nova Scotians. It's unfortunate, and I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to continuing this debate and to the next campaigns where Nova Scotians will be able to pass judgment on this Premier and his government's record in the last 4 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I came here to speak today. The opposition notified us yesterday that there's resolution number 26, which was tabled by the honourable member opposite from Richmond. And I read this resolution, and I prepared a few notes to talk about it, and then I listened to the speech, and of course his speech had nothing to do with the resolution at all. And so oftentimes that means that I'll probably digress a bit from what the resolution is all about, because the fact is that he also got in other areas which I think are important to talk about. And one of the things that he talked about is the commitment of the Premier to meet the commitments that we laid out in our Blue Book in the year of 1999. And Mr. Speaker, let's put the facts on the table. We were the only party who basically came forward with a plan. And we made a lot of commitments. And the people of Nova Scotia listened to that, and they supported our initiatives, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that we talked about was bringing about fiscal responsibility to the province and balancing our budget. And Mr. Speaker, I remember very clearly the member opposite and his colleagues saying, when we started to show the magnitude of the problem, and the magnitude was a $500 million deficit, Mr. Speaker. When we moved forward after a couple of years, they said we wouldn't be able to balance the budget. I remember very clearly that member and his caucus saying that we wouldn't be able to do it and that we wouldn't meet our commitment. Well, Mr. Speaker, we did. And the fact of the matter is that in this year, we've tabled another balanced budget, and we've also done a tax reduction, a tax cut in this reduction. And I remember those same members saying that we wouldn't be able to do that, and we've done it also. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other thing that he talked about in his discussion or his comments, he said that we're manipulating the numbers. I think he was talking about the fact that we'll massage the numbers. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I take offense to those comments, because we are in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles, Mr. Speaker. And the fact is, you know, when we took office, that bunch, and he was a member of that party, you know, they kept things off of the statements of the financial statements of the province, things such as Cisco and things such as NSRL, which had huge losses. And when they tabled their budgets, they didn't include that because that was bad news. And one of the first things that we did as a budget as we came in is that I, as a Minister of Finance, with the support of our caucus and our cabinet, brought in generally accepted accounting principles, whereby we brought something called consolidated financial statements. Now, for people who are lay people who don't understand that, what that means is that all the operations of government would get grouped together, and things such as NSRL and Cisco, which were huge money losers, Mr. Speaker, were added and they were shown in the financial statements of the province. And so I think that was a step forward, and I have to speak in regards to the NDP. I think I even heard the leader saying that he would continue with generally accepted accounting principles, that he believed in that. I haven't heard very much from the Liberal Party, and maybe their leader can have another statement in that regard that he may change the week after, but let's just hope that he at least espouses that he would follow generally accepted accounting principles. Now, Mr. Speaker, I should continue on this. I should continue on this line of point. But the member opposite also said something which I thought was very important. He talked about P3 schools, and he mentioned that the Department of Education said they didn't have a plan for school constructions, Mr. Speaker. And and I just look. This is a Learning for Life. It's a documentation that came up from the Department of Education, which shows a long-term plan for a school construction. And it talks about the numbers of dollars which have been allocated for schools construction in this province. And it talks about the fact that in 2001-2002, it had $80 million, 78.9, 89.3 the year after, and then this year it had $86 million for school construction. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're building schools different than the Liberal Party was. They were building schools called P3. And, Mr. Speaker, the people of this province remember very clearly the mishandling of literally hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money by the Liberal Party. Now, Mr. Speaker, the fact that they built those schools, and we all remember the Horton Highs, and we could list a whole litany of schools that were built by the Liberal government on P3. Now, why were they building on P3? They were doing it because the fact they could keep it off the books, and they were going to be leasing these schools, and the payments would only start after they were constructed, Mr. Speaker. So it showed up nowhere in the financial statements. Well, the first thing that we did as a government is that we stopped that practice, and we also said that they have to be recognized because the fact of the matter, the developers took very little risk, and the taxpayers of this province took all the risk, or virtually all the risk, and as such, those leases had to be shown as a capital asset and the liability shown on the financial statements of the province of Nova Scotia. Now, the member opposite said that we have added to the debt since we've taken office, and that is true. And the fact of the matter is we also told taxpayers that the fact that we would balance the budget in the third year, and the fact is that we had huge deficits in the first few years, obviously we would be adding to the deficit. This is a no-brainer. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other thing that came up is that in the number that he refers to that we've added to the debt, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we did is that we added huge amounts of schools that were announced by the previous government that had to be added in because the developers weren't taking any of the risk, and as such, they had to be shown on our financial statements. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party, just until recently, was still saying that they wanted to do P3 schools. Now, lately, with the publicity that's come out, where schools can't even run small fairs or cafeterias and get the money whereby they can give it to the students, Mr. Speaker, what happens is that the situation is...
Order. I recognize the member from Cape Breton West on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there were documents tabled today that would suggest quite to the contrary is what the Minister of Finance is trying to perpetuate on the people of Nova Scotia here today. It's totally erroneous what the Minister is saying.
That's a dispute between two members, not a point of order. I recognize the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. You asked the parents of those schools where they couldn't raise money because they were prohibited to. You ask those parents, Mr. Speaker, and they'll tell you that they were disadvantaged. You ask those people in those communities where they couldn't hold meetings because they had to pay huge fees, Mr. Speaker, and they are disadvantaged. Don't say to the people of this province that they weren't disadvantaged by P3, because they were. And the fact of the matter, this government changed it, Mr. Speaker. We went to the traditional matter that we build schools. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, I will say that we did keep the construction of standardized schools in the constructions. In other words, if there were models out there that we could incorporate, that we wouldn't have to redesign schools again, then we took it in. So today, you see many schools being built in the same manner, and that is to saving the architect fees, Mr. Speaker, and that is one thing that we did incorporate. So if there was something good, we took it. If there was something bad, we did not repeat it. And one we did not repeat is the mistakes. Now today, I hear that the Liberal leader, Mr. Graham, is announcing that he's not supporting P3. It took a long time for the Liberal Party to understand the errors of their ways, Mr. Speaker. But finally today, hallelujah, they have seen the light, Mr. Speaker. Now, Now, Mr. Speaker, in regards of other issues that were brought up on the table, one of which is that the member opposite said, he talked about, are things better today, And he says the Premier said, is health care better? Mr. Speaker, it is better. Mr. Speaker, is education better in this province? You darn right it's better. Mr. Speaker, are the roads better in this province today? You darn right they are, Mr. Speaker. Now, the fact of the matter is the members opposite, and the member opposite there, has tried to portray the Premier and the government as not being fiscally responsible. Mr. Speaker, we will compare our record and the amount of debt that we have added during our administration versus what that bunch did in the 6 years preceding any time, any place, anywhere. The bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, that we have made progress. Now with regards, how much time do I have left, Mr. Speaker? Oh, yeah, 7. This is really good, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in regards of the fact that the debt is increasing in this budget, the member opposite is correct. It is going up, Mr. Speaker. And the fact of the matter is, though, the debt in this year that we are adding to it, why are we doing that? And the reason that we are doing that, Mr. Speaker, is that we want to construct in this province assets or fixed assets, which we believe are important. And the member opposite spoke about the fact, are we building schools? You're darn right we are, Mr. Speaker. We're spending over $80 million in this year on new school construction, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, are we building roads? You're darn right we are, Mr. Speaker, and we're spending $106 million in this budget on roads, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, are we spending on hospital construction? You're darn right, Mr. Speaker, and we are also spending on hospital construction in this budget. I don't have that number in front of me by memory. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, those will be lasting assets. And I do agree, I do acknowledge that it will add to the debt. And I don't disagree with that, Mr. Speaker. And to say that I'm not at all concerned would be an understatement. I would much rather see the debt actually going down than going up. But, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the increase is a manageable one. And the fact of the matter is that our economy has continued to grow year after year. Now, people have said, do you have a debt management plan? Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we do. And the fact of the matter is I would list 3 different aspects that are there. The first one that we have is that we have made major initiatives in reducing the risk to our taxpayers in regards of our debt. When we came to office, 51% on August the 16th of 1999, when we took office, 51% of our debt was in foreign currencies. That is in Japanese yen or US dollars or in pound sterling. Now, Mr. Speaker, since that time we have made great progress, and I have to compliment the staff of the Department of Finance and the Debt Investment Section for their initiative. They have done a great job, and the men and women that work there deserve, I think, our recognition and our thanks, because as we stand today, the amount of debt that is in foreign currencies is less than 20%, and it's 19.7 or 8%. Now, that is a major increase. Now, Mr. Speaker, that is a major point of our debt management plan, because what we have done is limited the risk. The second part that we have done, Mr. Speaker, is that we have also grown our economy. The fact that our economy has grown means that our capacity to service our debt or to manage our debt has improved. And when we came to March 31st, 2000, a few months after we came to office, our debt to GDP ratio was at 46.4%, Mr. Speaker. And as the fiscal year ended just a few days ago, our debt to GDP ratio was 42.5, and at the end of this fiscal year, the projections show that our debt to GDP ratio will be 41.1. Now, for people, Mr. Speaker, for those who say, well, what does net direct debt to GDP ratio mean? What it is our capacity to deal with our debt. In other words, what is, for an analogy, if someone has a home and has a mortgage, can he service that mortgage? Of course, his income will determine whether he can service that mortgage properly. Our GDP of our province is basically the income of the province versus the debt that we have. So we have made marked improvement in that regard. Now, Mr. Speaker, a few other issues that we have done, which is very important, that I think should be recognized. Look, we sold the assets of NSRL. And when we sold it, there were many people who said we shouldn't have sold it. The NDP party said that, and so did the Liberal Party. But, Mr. Speaker, the NSRL was opening the province to huge risk, because to stay into the offshore gas and oil industry is a big risk game, and you have to be very good at it. And to give an analogy, just to drill one offshore well, Mr. Speaker, is sometimes in the $70 to $80 million. This province cannot put the taxpayers' money at risk in doing so. But when we sold that, Mr. Speaker, we sold those assets in the vicinity of $380 to $390 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, many governments would have been tempted to say, well, why don't we put that on roads? It wasn't an election year. Why don't we spend more this year? Now, Mr. Speaker, our government showed prudence. It showed that it had the taxpayers' interests at heart and that we should manage the debt. And we did not go on a spending spree when we sold NSRL. And that is to the credit of people such as our Premier and also our Cabinet, that we showed the resolve that we were headed in the right direction. So just those three examples of what we have told that I've just listed are all positives for us, how we manage our debt. Now, to go back to the increase that we had in this year, which is $118 million, I will still say, Mr. Speaker, that that number is manageable, and I'll say for two reasons. One of which is that the schools that we have announced are very much needed. We're concerned about the health and the quality of environments that our children are in schools, and for that, I think we all agree. And we've been asked by all members of this House, of all three parties, to do improvements, and I can go through resolutions and questions here as to when we're going to fix schools, whether it's Sir John A., or whether it's schools, or whether it was the Halifax West or other schools throughout Nova Scotia, and we are responding in a responsible manner. The other thing that's happened, Mr. Speaker, is that we have also made investments into our roads, and we've announced in this year the start of a bridge replacement program. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are those who would say that you should not invest in capital projects, that we should defer them to a later date. There is a business application to wait much longer. I am concerned that the cost to repair those assets, if we wait much longer, will actually increase dramatically. So I look at this as an investment in the infrastructure of our highways, which will benefit our citizens. It will benefit many of our rural communities. It will benefit Metro, because the fact of the matter, there is considerable freight going in and out of this hub. And the fact is, we need those roads to keep our economy going. So these are all assets, Mr. Speaker, which will serve Nova Scotia's economy and its citizens well. And for that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your time and the members' indulgence during my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here or sit here and listen to the debate back and forth, I have a hard time telling the difference between these other two parties in the House, Mr. Speaker, because when the Liberals were on that side, they were saying exactly the same things that minister's saying. When that minister was on this side, he's saying exactly the same things that they're now saying. And so it's like back and forth, and nothing ever changes, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes, bringing it back to the actual resolution that's before us, Mr. Speaker, sometimes I wonder if the Premier really understands public finances in Nova Scotia. This is the Premier who said in the last election campaign that he saw no reason why the health system couldn't be operated on $1.5 billion. Of course, now, just 4 short years later, we're at $2.1 billion, and the only people who believe that Nova Scotians are more satisfied with their health system are the people sitting on that side of the House. They say it, but I wonder sometimes if they really believe it. It's certainly not what I'm hearing in my constituency. So if the Premier says you can do it on $1.5 billion, but he really needs $2.1 billion and counting, did the Premier not understand the health system when he was running in the last election? Or did he understand it and said something that he knew wasn't true? Those are your only two choices. And this is the same Premier who said that he could fix the health system for $46.5 million. $46.5 million, which the Premier said that he would find by cutting out administrative waste in the health system. It's all he needed, he said, to fix the healthcare system. And now he's spent another $600 million and counting. So you have to ask yourself again, you've only got two choices. Either the Premier didn't understand what he was talking about, or he did understand what he was talking about and say something that he knew not to be true. And it's the same thing when you get to the debt, which is the subject matter of the resolution before the House today. The Premier said that under his government, the debt of the province would stop growing. Now, he said that, and he said that during the election and only just a couple years ago, but the problem is it's not true. It's not true. So does the Premier, again, does he not understand public finance? Or does he really understand it but say things that he knows not to be true? Those are the only choices that we have. And the thing that this government seems to want people not to understand is that we are losing sight of our objective. Because the overall objective here is not to deal with the debt. It's not to deal with the deficit. It is to reduce the amount of money that this province sends out of province to banks and bondholders in interest payments on the debt every year. That's the prize that we have to keep our eyes on. Now, when you leave aside all of the public relations spin of the government, what's really going on? And I'm just going to use the government's own figures, Mr. Speaker, to sort of lay out what's really going on before I get on to what it is that we have to do about it, what we can do about it. The truth of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that in 0203, it is forecast that net debt servicing costs, in other words, interest on the debt, is going to take 16.3%. 16.3 cents of every dollar that we spend in Nova Scotia is going to interest on the debt. That is far too high. It's higher than I think any other province, or if there is another province that's higher, it's not by much. The average is around 10 cents out of every dollar. We're sending 16.3 cents out of the province, and that's only to pay the interest. That's not even to pay down the debt by one dime. And if this government's forecasts prove to be true, that number is going to go down to 15.8% if the numbers are true. Now, it's a debate for another day whether the numbers presented by the government's budget are credible. But the problem is, Mr. Speaker, and these are the government's own numbers from page B22 of the budget documents, is the year after that, it's going up to 16.9% and staying there. The amount of money that we are sending out of the province the year after next is going to head up to over $1 billion, higher than it's ever been in the history of Nova Scotia. The percentage that we're sending out of the province is going up to 17.1%, the highest it's been certainly on this chart. Don't know if the highest in the history of the province, but it's actually going up. And what this government wants Nova Scotians to believe is that they've got the debt and debt servicing costs under control, but they don't. They don't. And their own numbers say so. The debt is not going down. It's not even staying steady. It's going up. The amount of money that we send out of the province every year is not going down. It's going up. The percentage of the annual budget that we're sending out of province in interest on the debt is not going down. It's going up. But they don't want Nova Scotians to know that. They want Nova Scotians to believe something that is simply not true. And that, more than anything, would explain why this government is now spending enough money for every single minister in the cabinet to have 4 communications advisors. Because what's more important to this government right now is not what's true, it's what you can make people believe is true. So let's keep in mind what the prize is here. The prize is making the amount of money we're sending out to banks and bondholders go down. So, Mr. Speaker, what can we do about it? Which is a question that is often asked to us in this legislature, and as usual, the NDP has good constructive ideas. Now, I noticed that the minister said that the government soon, before the election, is going to introduce a debt management plan, which I thought was most peculiar, because he introduced a debt management plan a few months ago. and he had a big news conference down in the foyer of Province House and said, here it is. He waved it around and said, here's our debt management plan. And now he says he's going to introduce another one. I'm a bit puzzled about what's going on. Apparently, without his telling us so, the first one proved not to be good enough. Because, of course, it was no debt management plan at all. All it was a few bar charts showing that the debt to GDP ratio was going down, and the minister said that was good enough. Now, like most of the figures in the budget, his bar chart showing that the debt to GDP ratio goes down depends on a number of assumptions which are questionable. Now, John McLeod, the money editor of the Halifax Daily News, no friend to the NDP, was the first one after the budget to raise questions about the government's growth targets. If those growth targets don't prove to be true, if they prove to be too rosy, as the business editor of the Daily News says, then guess what? Even that figure, the debt to GDP ratio, isn't going to go down, it's going to go up. But that's not going to be apparent to people till after the election, and all this government cares about now is what can you make people believe up to Election Day. And it doesn't matter that the veil is going to be lifted the day afterwards, or a month afterwards, or 6 months afterwards. All that matters is the impression you can leave with people up until voting day. The first thing we need, Mr. Speaker, is a debt target. We all need to agree on what a reasonable level of debt is. We don't even have that. We haven't even had that debate in Nova Scotia, because let's be clear, some debt's okay. Like many Nova Scotians, I have personal debt. I owe money on my house, but I have an offsetting asset. I owe money on my car, but I have an offsetting asset. It's okay when you have assets to have debt. The question is how much. The tragedy of Nova Scotia public finances is that we have a debt of well over $11 billion and assets of under $3 billion. That's a problem. Because when you add up my house and my car, and the value of my assets is more than the amount that I owe on those assets. So in debt terms, I'm doing all right. But the province's problem is it owes nearly $12 billion and has only $3 billion in assets. So we have almost $9 billion not accounted for, gone astray. Where's it gone? Where did John Buchanan spend it? Where did he hide it? That's where the debt problem arose. The Liberals tried when they came into office to deal with it and couldn't. And by the time the McClellan years came around, they'd completely given up on any attempt to control the debt. And this crowd came in and they hacked and slashed, and the Auditor General said they did it without any idea of the consequences of their hacking and slashing. That's a topic for another day as well. But they still, despite hacking and slashing on the one hand, and raising taxes and user fees by $300 million on the other hand, they still haven't got the debt under control. The debt is still going up. So we need to come to a consensus about what is a reasonable level of debt. And I would put out for discussion, as we did in April 2002, two possible targets. One is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio to 20% by the year 2020. Now that's an ambitious target. That's an ambitious target, and what it would take is a payment on the debt each and every year between now and 2020 of $200 million. That's, leaving all aside the minister's flim-flammery about some bucks are not equal to other bucks and capital bucks are okay, but operating bucks are not okay, and that it's okay if the debt's growing as long as you're spending it on capital bucks. A dollar of debt is a dollar of debt. Doesn't matter where it comes from. And what we need to do is have the amount of our debt go down by $200 million each and every year from 2003 to the year 2020. And then we'll reduce the debt to GDP ratio to 20%. That's ambitious. A slightly less ambitious target, but one that probably is more appropriate, is to reduce the amount of money that we send out of the province in interest on the debt to 10% by the year 2020. That would bring it down to the provincial average, And it means that only 10 cents on the dollar would be sent out of the province by the year 2020. And in order to meet that target, just to meet the provincial average, requires a payment on the debt each and every year of $100 million. Even that is an ambitious target, Mr. Speaker. Even that's an ambitious target. The Minister of, what is he the Minister of now? The Minister of Justice was just barking something across the way there, and I didn't quite catch it, although if he wants to join the debate, he's free to do that. So reducing it even to the provincial average is an ambitious target. But, Mr. Speaker, what we have to do is come to some kind of a social consensus on the target, and then we have to come to some kind of social consensus on a plan of how to get there. And a good model for that is what Robert Stanfield did with the Voluntary Planning Board when he came into office in 1956. Because what he did was he took all the social stakeholders and brought them together in a way that there was province-wide buy-in on his plan of economic development. And although we're a long way away from those days and the Voluntary Planning Board is quite a different beast now than it was then, that model of respectful province-wide consultation across the province is one that we need to follow again. We need to have a commitment to looking at both sides of the ledger, and in particular, people have to feel that the tax system is fair. I'm not the one who's going to have to stand on the doorstep in this election and explain to 300,000 tax-paying Nova Scotians why they are not going to get any money out of this government. The members on that side are going to have to do that, but I don't. But it's exactly that kind of inequity. It's not exactly that kind of inequity that makes people lose faith in the fairness of the tax system. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the final part of what we need is a commitment to openness, a commitment to tell the truth about provincial finances, a commitment to regularly publicizing truthful information and not simply spending money on politically motivated advertising, Mr. Speaker. That's the way forward. That's where we need to go, and that's how we can get there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the member from Cape Breton West. On point of order for the Minister of Justice?
Is the debate over on this?
No. Recognize the member from Cape Breton West.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak on Resolution 26, dealing with the financial issues of the province. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, I listened very attentively to the dissertation put forth by the Minister of Finance. And I was sitting there and I was thinking to myself, well, he waxed pretty good eloquence. And it sounded pretty good. But there were a number, and it made to someone, the untrained ear, it probably was. Now, look at the reality, Mr. Speaker. We saw what happened last year with the former Minister of Community Services. He announced over $60 million of funding for his department, but he forgot to tell the people of Nova Scotia it was all federal money. Yes, Mr. Speaker, federal money. And then this year, the present Minister of Community Services receives $12 million plus from the federal government, $11 million, and they only spend $2 million. They're sitting on $9 million of federal money. In other words, we don't even know what they're going to do with it, Mr. Speaker, aside from play politics, which my colleague from Clare exposed earlier today. Mr. Speaker, let's look at the Minister of Finance comments about the P3 process. Well, how ironic, Mr. Speaker, this is on the agenda today for the government. What a great way to divert attention away from the fact that this government is downloading on the municipalities the cost of education. A 5% increase in property taxes, Mr. Speaker, because of this Minister of Finance's budget. Mr. Speaker, why wouldn't they want to talk about an issue that was debated 2 years ago and 3 years ago before public accounts and before the legislature? and has been thoroughly dealt with. But no, Mr. Speaker, they have to continue to regurgitate matters of the past so as to use it as a smokescreen to take the people's attention away from the reality of the situation. This government is downloading on the property taxpayers of Nova Scotia, the cost of education in this budget. That's what's happening, Mr. Speaker. It's a sham what this government is trying to do. The Minister of Finance says, "Oh, how great thou art." Am I? Well, you wonder why we would be suspect. I will table part of the minister's budget from just 2 years ago, which there's an error in calculation, Mr. Speaker. Over a $5.229 million error in his calculations. On page 64 of the supplement to the public accounts, on debt servicing cost, the minister has indicated that the total cost is $1,020,616,823.70. But, Mr. Speaker, when you do the calculations, he's off by $5,229,919.94. He can't even add. He can't even add. I'll table the document. It's its own document, Mr. Speaker. You wonder why we would be suspect of what this minister would bring before the floor of the legislature. He can't even add. Mr. Speaker, we saw what he did by deliberately and methodically leaving out of the budget almost $60 million of health care dollars that should have been included in this budget. Why did they do that, Mr. Speaker? Pray tell. I wonder if it's because of politics. I wonder if it's the minister's way of using federal dollars to play politics to secure votes in the next election. Now, I don't think he would do that. He's not going to reoffer. But I wonder if the gentleman sitting to his left may have kind of nudged him a bit and said, "We've got to make this look really good. We've got a blue pamphlet floating around the province here and everybody's household saying that we're going to give them back a rebate." Well, Mr. Speaker, not too many people took kindly to that type of pork barrel politics. That's a thing of the past. And for the Premier or any of the backroom boys in the Tory party to think that that's the way that they're going to win this election, it's not going to work. It's not going to work, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we'll just give a few examples. You know, we had the member for Yarmouth today. Well, he thought he was a good member. He got up at public accounts today, and he demanded to know how was the cost of the P3 schools put forth. And the representatives from the Department of Education said the costing was done on a per square footage basis. Well, it's lowest tender, right? Yes, it is, they answered. Well, the lowest tender for such and such a project was $5 million, right? Yes. But yet the final cost was $8 million. Why the overrun? Well, quite simply, we increased the size. We increased the square footage. How many square feet? Mr. Speaker, something that all the stakeholders asked for. All the stakeholders except for that member. He didn't want to hear the truth. He didn't want to hear the fact that the people in the community, the parents, the teachers, the students, the school board, the municipality, they all accepted that. But see, he couldn't. He tried to make politics out of nothing, Mr. Speaker. Was it a perfect process? No, it was not. It was not, Mr. Speaker. And they indicated that. But those representatives that came here today said that they received good value for the taxpayers' money. Is what the Tories trying to do is set up a smoke screen? Are they trying to set up a smoke screen so they can start closing more schools in rural Nova Scotia? Are they trying to set us up so they can find an excuse to start closing some of these P3 schools? Maybe that's what's behind all this, Mr. Speaker. That's another way of closing more schools. and downloading the cost of education on the municipalities. Mr. Speaker, they talk about what a great job they're doing. Well, let's look at the evening news down in Glasgow there on October 11, 2002, where the provincial government put $200,000 to establish a truck stop, a rest stop they call it, rather. Well, Mr. Speaker, what about all the disabled people in Nova Scotia? What about the seniors who find it difficult to operate these self-service operations? It's a self-service operation. There's nothing there to help the disadvantaged of Nova Scotia. Anyone that wants to go to New Glasgow would ask, why would you spend $200,000 of the taxpayers' money and not try and help as many Nova Scotians as possible? I don't think that's fair, and I think every MLA in this legislature can identify with constituents that are not in a position to get out of their vehicle for one reason or the other and be able to receive service at that service station. So who was the government trying to help? Was it trying to help the people of Nova Scotia or just another corporate friend? Is that the dogma, the neoconservative dogma that's penetrating and pervasive through that entire Conservative caucus? I hope not. You know, the odd time there's a flicker of light over there and we get right excited. But then, all of a sudden, a little breeze comes along and it goes out. You know why? Because the Rob Bathersons writes out another little script for the Premier and he has to follow it. He goes home, has another nightmare, and comes back in and he recites what he was advised to memorize. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's just about what it's coming to. Mr. Speaker, I recall when the Premier was on this side of the House, he took great glee when the injured workers were protesting day in and day night, 24 hours a day at the Premier's office. And you know, recently, he was in court. The Premier was, our good Premier. And then on Saturday, March 22nd, 2003, Hem tells court suspect is interfering. In other words, somebody was boycotting in front of his constituency office. And you know what he said? He's sick and tired of sit-ins. He's sick of them. Even though he acknowledges he encouraged, and I will table this document for the enlightenment of members of the Conservative caucus, even though he did it when he was on this side of the floor. What a change of mindset now that he's over there. See, that goes to the Rumsfeld plan. Less control. Less control. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I've started to realize how bad they were when they were on this side. They were worse than I thought they were, because they actually did worse than they were over here. Some of them should have stayed here, where they couldn't inflict damage on the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'll table that document. I feel bad for the Premier. He must be having nightmares, because that's not the honest John that we would like to think he is. But then again, we had an honest John once before, and look what happened to the province. It went to the verge of bankruptcy. It went to the verge of bankruptcy. And what happened when the Liberals got in power in 1993? When they went to see the bonding agencies down in New York, what were they told, or what were they asked? Where's the lobster? That's what our predecessor always provided us. They didn't ask about what they were doing with the books or foreign debt. Mr. Speaker, they wanted to know what the lobster was, because they were giving everything away. They gave everything but the kitchen sink, Mr. Speaker, and that's the sad part about it. Mr. Speaker, when members of the Conservative caucus were on this side of the floor, they just berated the government every chance they had, and especially on the issue of power rates. Mr. Speaker, a recent flyer we received, and I know we're not allowed to use props, but this is a recent flyer that we received from Nova Scotia Power. Rate increases. What's the government done and said about that? Not a thing. Not a thing, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because they're gouging the taxpayers through the provincial portion of the HST. Another silent hit on the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, on home heating fuel, on gas, for propane stoves, went up another 6 cents per litre effective March 3rd of this year. What did the government say? Nothing. Where are all the cheerleaders and the backbenchers? It was great when they were talking about fishing licenses. Oh, yes, we want free fishing licenses, but we don't care if your heating bill goes up. We don't care if your light bill goes up. We don't care if you pay more at the gas pumps. And if we do, we're not allowed to say. We're not allowed to say because, you know, the Minister of Finance is playing this smoking screens game with the budget. He's trying to make people believe that because of all the other expenditures and all the other savings, that in the final analysis, the government isn't getting any extra money. Oh, Mr. Speaker, you would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb to believe what that minister says on that issue. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I don't mean that in a negative, derogatory fashion. And if it came across that way, I apologize. But you'd have to be completely...
Please, the honourable member for Colchester Muscatava Valley on a point of order.
Yes, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Cape Breton West is struggling along there a little bit. He referenced fishing licenses. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to say and give the honourable member the opportunity to condemn a measure that this government brought in. If he wants to rethink this issue, he referenced the fact that fishing licenses were somehow a burden on Nova Scotians. And I want to point out that it was this government that lowered freshwater fishing licenses fee for resident seniors in the province of Nova Scotia by $11.50 when they put in a rate of $7.
Order. Order, please. It's not a point of order. Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton West. You have about 10 seconds left. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Not a point of
he
order.
was the member that said it was going to be free. Nothing is free coming from that Tory caucus. They've gouged and gouged and gouged.
Order, please.
Sorry,
Order, please. Time allotted for the resolution has expired. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you call Resolution 417, please?
Resolution 417. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll read the operating clause of Resolution 417, please. Therefore, it be resolved that it has been the Conservative government that has not provided its fair share of funding for Nova Scotians, not the federal government. Mr. Speaker, when you look at this year's housing budget, the federal government is increasing their funding by $11.2 million, and the provincial government is cutting its funding for housing by $8.6 million. So obviously, many people are asking, what's going on? The federal government is investing $11.2 million more in our housing programs, and at the same time, the province is cutting their level of funding. Well, Mr. Speaker, this provincial government has a bad habit. It seems when the federal government puts money forward, invests money in programs in Nova Scotia, the province takes some of their own funding out of the provincial programs. And we've seen this happening, Mr. Speaker, not just with the housing program, but we've seen this happening with the federal Millennium Scholarships back in '99. On one side, we saw the federal government trying to help our post-secondary students, and at the same time, we see the province cutting out our loan remission program 2 years ago. Mr. Speaker, this Tory government 2 years ago cut the entire loan remission program that had $10 million in it for our students here at home. But now, guess what? When the election call around the corner, last week the Tory government decided to announce a $5.1 million loan remission program. Mind you, available only to students available this fall. So you really have to wonder, what kind of political games are we playing here? Back in '99, the feds pump in money in the Millennium Scholarship Program. The provincial government cut back their $10 million in our loan remission program. And on the eve of an election, the Tory provincial government announces a $5.1 million. So there's still another $5 million somewhere, Mr. Speaker. And now, Mr. Speaker, the provincial government decides to cut back $9 million out of our housing budget. Mr. Speaker, there was an article that appeared on Monday, province holding on to federal housing money. When the Minister of Community Services was asked in defending this Tory government decision, the minister indicated we might put more money in the housing program as the year progresses. Well, Mr. Speaker, all I can say, if you believe that, I don't think that the people of Nova Scotia will buy this. But maybe if the Minister of Community Services had said, we as a Tory government, we need to find $68 million to help pay for these $155 checks that people will be getting probably before the election. And my government needs to find some money somewhere. And maybe by taking this $9 million out of housing to help pay for these checks, maybe, Mr. Speaker, people of Nova Scotia would have believed him. I just want to make a short reference to the budget speech, page 11. Mr. Speaker, in addition, the province will provide a $155 Nova Scotia taxpayer refund to all Nova Scotians who pay provincial income tax. As many as 438,000 Nova Scotians will receive this refund. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, we know that there's approximately 300,000 Nova Scotians that will not be getting this so-called rum bottle check. Yet, Mr. Speaker, these 300,000 Nova Scotians have been paying higher insurance premiums that this provincial government has benefited from. This government, Mr. Speaker, has increased gas taxes. Again, this government has benefited from. These 300,000 Nova Scotians have been paying higher oil prices this winter, and yet again, this government has benefited from. And then when you look, Mr. Speaker, at the last 4 years, with all the fees that have been introduced by this Tory government, along the way, these 300,000 people have again been paying their fair share. But yet, when the speech from the throne was delivered, not one word was said. Not one word was said about these 300,000 folks. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you have been asked, just like I have, and I'm sure all members of this House have been asked, where is the government going to find this $68 million to pay for these $438,000 checks that will be sent out? Just where? Where are they going to find the money? So you have to assume the money has to come from somewhere. So it's either from the Minister of Fisheries, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Community Services. The money has to come from somewhere. And when you look at this type of cut, Mr. Speaker, then people will make up their own mind where this money is coming from. Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia will not be fooled by this latest political gimmick that this government has come up with. Mr. Speaker, I tried to imagine what the cabinet table was like for a moment when the budget was being developed, and it all became clear to me. We have the Premier and the Minister of Finance at the head of the table saying we need to find $68 million for our 155 rum bottles. Any volunteers? And the first to put his hand up, maybe, was the Minister of Community Services. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, who pays? Who pays? Certainly in the case, and this afternoon we had individuals from the RRSS here, Mr. Speaker, trying to bring their story to the attention of the people of Nova Scotia. But again, you know, those most vulnerable in society will probably have to pay. And again, in housing, those, again, most vulnerable will have to pay again. You know, $9 million that could go towards social housing, $9 million that could go towards repairs and construction, you know, put on hold by this minister and by this government. Mr. Speaker, there is real need out there, real need. And I would dare to say that there probably isn't one MLA in this House who couldn't stand up and say that in the last month, I didn't have a call. I didn't have a call from a constituent seeking support through housing programs. I'm sure that there's not one. Mr. Speaker, if this is not an indication of the need that's out there, I don't know what it is. I truly don't know what it is. But Mr. Speaker, for every one of these calls, I dare to say there's probably a lot more that are in need. But interestingly enough today, I asked the minister to table his plan for the social housing money. Show us where he's going to spend it when he ever gets around doing it, Mr. Speaker. But what do we see, Mr. Speaker? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was like talking to a brick wall. There's no shame.
Mud wall.
There was no remorse. We just saw an eager beaver of a minister who was willing to hold money back in his department to help pay for this $68 million promise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was not that long ago. In fact, it was back during the winter when a government document showed that this government was more concerned with budgets than they were about people. Well, Mr. Speaker, here's the chance today. This minister could release that $9 million and become an example of this cabinet, a caring example for Nova Scotia, a member that cares about the needs of the people of this province. But yet, I fail to understand why a minister, let alone a government, wouldn't do this. What's wrong, Mr. Speaker? You have to really ask yourself, you know, isn't there any good photo ops when you put out money into housing repairs or upgrading housing units? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to be able to get up today and speak on this resolution, and I want to thank the member opposite for inspiring me, because he brought up a number of topics that are near and dear to my heart. And Mr. Speaker, one thing that the member opposite brought up, which in fact the Premier demonstrated today as the statesman that he is, was giving the federal government credit for their contribution to the things that they do bring to the provincial government. And Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the member opposite that that is recognized by this government, and the federal government does provide about a third of the tax revenues. It's dropping, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia is becoming more prosperous and more self-sufficient. And with that, Mr. Speaker, it means we are less dependent on the federal government. However, Mr. Speaker, the federal government does contribute to some very important programs across the country. Early childhood development is one, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to point out that the former Minister of Community Services was very careful to point that out in his press releases. They were given credit. And just recently, Mr. Speaker, about a month ago, I had the pleasure of coming to an agreement with the federal minister responsible for HRDC, and it was an early learning and childcare program. And yes, Mr. Speaker, it is funded by the federal government and delivered by the provinces. And in our press release, I specifically made sure that that was clear. Give them credit. Today, Mr. Speaker, there was a momentous occasion in the Minister of Environment and Labor's constituency. There was a great announcement for the people of not only the Annapolis Valley, but everybody that uses the 101. And Mr. Speaker, the Premier went out of his way to recognize that the federal government, because it is part of the national highway system, did provide 50% of the funding. What a gentleman. There was no federal representative there, but the Premier made sure that the federal government did get credit for it, and he mentioned the two ministers that also assisted in making that happen. That being Minister Thibeault and Minister Rock. So while the member opposite suggests that we're perhaps not giving the federal government their recognition, I would suggest that the Premier's actions today, and I would suggest the actions of my colleagues in the past, in fact, would suggest that was not the case. Mr. Speaker, we're also talking about the prosperity of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is becoming a healthier, more prosperous, and self-sufficient province. And that, in part, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest is because some of the good things that have happened under this government. Mr. Speaker, we are now generating more of our own revenues, which gives us more independence and allows us to be less dependent on the federal government. But let's talk about some of the good things that are going on in housing, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to improving the health, the well-being, and self-sufficiency of Nova Scotians by providing affordable housing to low-income families, seniors, and individuals that have mental or physical challenges. That is very important to us, Mr. Speaker, as a government. I think it's very important to Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, this is done through the Housing Division of the Department of Community Services. We, in fact, offer a wide range of housing programs and services to assist close to 20,000 Nova Scotian households each year. These include rental housing accommodation and rent supplements. And Mr. Speaker, every MLA in this room knows about the rent supplement program. For those that come into public housing, instead of having to pay a fixed rental amount, which may be beyond their means to afford, they only pay a percentage of their income. So if their income, Mr. Speaker, is, say, only $1,000 a month, then they pay accordingly. And depending on their income, it's either 30 or 25%. There are other good things through this program, Mr. Speaker. I think every MLA in this room has made use of housing services for constituents in need, and it is a wonderful thing, Mr. Speaker, to be able to do that for those constituents, and they are so appreciative. This is indeed a wonderful program. Also, grants and loans for home repairs and renovations. I'm sure every constituent here can think of times when they've had a telephone call that somebody's well has gone dry, or there's a problem with their septic system, or the roof is leaking, and who came to the rescue but our grant and loan program through the Department of Community Services Housing Division. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, speaking to the member, the previous speaker's point, that is a cost-shared program between the federal and the provincial government, and I would like to acknowledge the federal government's not only participation in that, but the wise decision that the minister made by extending that with the recent federal budget for another 3 years. Also, we provide mortgages to people. Sometimes, if they qualify under certain circumstances, there's no need for a down payment, in other words, an equity position. That is an incredible thing to be able to offer to a constituent that otherwise would have no chance of being able to afford their own house. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to talk a little bit about the social housing agreement, which leads actually directly to explain how it was that we were able to do this year. Under the social housing agreement, which was signed, incidentally, in 1997, not during the term of this government, between the federal and provincial governments, and I guess specifically it's between Central Mortgage and Housing and the Housing Corporation, the Nova Scotia Building Housing Corporation. The province agreed to assume responsibility for administering the province's social housing programs. We took them over, but it was on the understanding that the federal government live up to its existing commitments that are in place. These run out to actually 2035, Mr. Speaker. So the federal government is committed to living up to those obligations. And each year, Mr. Speaker, the federal government provides the funding for these programs directly to the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation. The province then draws from the Housing Corporation the funding to cover the costs for providing these various programs, such as the rental income supplement after we get the 30 or 25% rental contribution from our tenants. The municipal and provincial contributions have all been applied. The balance, Mr. Speaker, then comes from the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation. And Mr. Speaker, partly as a result of declining interest rates, the cost of providing these programs has dropped under the administration of the province. There is an account called the Deferred Federal Contribution Account, which actually, Mr. Speaker, as of 2001, had accumulated a surplus of some $14 million, roughly. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, this government has twice, not once, but twice, made additional contributions to housing. Once at the end of the 2001-2002 fiscal year for approximately $5 million, and again last year another $5 million, concluding 2002-2003. So you see, Mr. Speaker, due to the efficient management within the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation, creating a surplus, plus additional payments made by this government, we have accumulated about a $21 million surplus. And it is that, Mr. Speaker, that allowed us to draw from it to cover the balance of our housing budget, leaving a balance of approximately $19 million in surplus at the end of 2003-2004. This fluctuation in the surplus account gives the impression that the federal government has increased its contribution to housing, Mr. Speaker. This is not accurate. I repeat, that is not accurate. It's simply a function of the flexibility in our long-term agreement with the federal government, that is between Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation and the Nova Scotia Housing Development Corporation, that enables us to reduce or increase the amount of funds in this surplus account as required. Setting the record straight, I would like to say that first, again, the province has not received an increase in federal funding for housing this year. That is not the case, Mr. Speaker. Definitely not. The agreements remain the same. Second, all federal funding provided to the corporation can only be used for housing programs and not other social programs.
Good clarification.
Affordable housing that is safe, appropriate, and sustainable is a priority for this province. We have demonstrated our commitment to housing year after year by injecting additional funding into this important program whenever possible. This includes an extra $10 million over and above the regular funding that the province has contributed to housing over the past 2 years, as well as other initiatives such as the Canada Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Program, our commitment there, the Residential Rehabilitation Assistance Program, and the Supporting Community Partnership Initiative to combat homelessness. Mr. Speaker, just a few thoughts to set the record straight. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I take my place to rise and speak on Resolution 417. Mr. Speaker, I do want to say that there is surely something that does occur when the member moves to the government side of this legislative assembly. There must be some euphoric something emanating from the floor, Mr. Speaker. There must be some euphoric lift as a result of winning the election campaign that just simply keeps them at an all-time high for a 4-year period, and then all of a sudden they slide down and they become social responsible citizens again. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say that because I want to go back to 1993 when, in fact, the federal Liberal government came to power. And the federal Liberal government came to power. It, in fact, said that it was going to get out of the housing business. And, in fact, it simply did that. In 1993 to 1998, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government was in power in the province of Nova Scotia. During their period of time, they've said nothing. They did nothing to go and talk to the federal government with respect to their program in public housing. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I just want to go back to a period of time. Remember that the Liberal government was in power from 1993 through to 1998. During that period of time, from the Department of Housing, they provided reports, and they had a report called the Provincial Housing Strategy, a summary regional discussion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that came forward in December of 1996. Then again, on July of 1997, they provided a report called the New Direction for Social Housing. Mr. Speaker, again, in 1998, just before the election campaign, the Liberals provided another report from the department.
Order, please. Very difficult to hear the speaker. I'd ask all members to take their conversations outside, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth North has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, in 1998, just before the election campaign, the Liberals decided that there would be another report come from the Department of Housing, and that was called Housing for Tomorrow, a New Direction for Provincial Housing Action. And that came forward in April of 1998. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you that not one of those reports had been enacted upon. Not one of those reports. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the Conservative government came to power in 1999, one thing I can't fault them for is their blue book, which said a strong leadership, a clear course. They did not break a promise with respect to housing in that report because there were no promises to public housing, Mr. Speaker. There wasn't one single promise. As a matter of fact, in 1998 in their election campaign, they did make one commitment to cooperative housing, and that was in their platform called Putting People First. And that platform, they did agree that they would allow cooperative housing to administer their own affairs. During that period of time, Mr. Speaker, that's the only thing that came from this Conservative government. I will tell you what this Conservative government did do, and it's the first government in the province of Nova Scotia to ever do, was sell modest housing to the private sector simply because they did not provide that modest housing, and there were 2 modest housing homes that were sold about a year ago, Mr. Speaker. Both of those modest housing homes could have been provided to citizens who needed housing. Again, this Conservative government allowed, under the Nova Scotia Department of Housing, an application to rezone a parcel of land that was slated for a 15-unit senior citizens development. That government allowed the province to turn around and make an application to the municipality to rezone the parcel of land. And that happened less than a year ago. Mr. Speaker, in this province, there's right here in the metro area. In this province, there are many pockets of area that need public housing and social housing. We can talk about the town of Antigonish. The town of Antigonish, of course, you know, is a university community. There are many people in dire need of social housing in that community. The town of Kentville as well, there are many people in need of social housing. We can talk about across the province the need for public and social housing, Mr. Speaker, all of which that government hasn't done. As a matter of fact, I will tell you that I was in Middleton approximately before December, and I happened to take the tour in Middleton, and I had a view of the new 15-unit site that's being built in Middleton. I must say that that's the only piece of new development that I've seen in public housing, both by the Liberals and the Conservative government, since 1993. Since 1993, that's the only new development of social housing that I have seen during that period of time. Mr. Speaker, there are people who have come to this government, and I can name those individuals. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, there were individuals who have come to this government and spoke on the issues. The Nova Scotia Allergy Environmental Health Association has spoke on the issue of healthy homes. They have talked to the government about this. The North End Health Community Centre, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Nova Scotia, the Community Action on Homelessness Steering Group, Mr. Speaker, Adsum House, the Federation of Senior Citizens and Pensioners of Nova Scotia, the Preston Area Opportunities Funds for Action, the Metro Nonprofit Housing, and the list goes on and on and on. They have come here and they have talked to this government and asked this government to provide social housing, Mr. Speaker. To this very day, the government has not set out an agenda for public housing. It has talked the talk, Mr. Speaker, but it has not walked the walk. The government sits on $38 million. One half of that came from the federal government of Canada. We do not have a policy of where the government has not told this party or Nova Scotians what they intend to do with that commitment over the 5-year period. Again, there's an additional $9 million that we know that we're talking about today. Mr. Speaker, that $9 million coupled with the $38 million couldn't even address the social housing issues that are here in the metropolitan area. The population continues to migrate. It continues to center itself here in the Halifax metro area. And it's a huge population shift. There are people who are on waiting lists, 1,300 of them, for the Metro Regional Housing Authority alone, Mr. Speaker, who are there for at least 2 years or more, waiting for this government to come up with some sort of a housing policy. Now, I know the government will use its programs because it's an election year, particularly around the Residential Rehabilitation Assistance Program, and provide the funding for those needs for home repairs and so on, and I think that that should be. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, many of us don't know that the money is run out before we even receive it from the federal government of Canada. And with respect to the federal government of Canada's housing, with respect to the 1997 Federal Housing Agreement, it was only an agreement that allowed the federal government to get off the hook, in my opinion, for providing housing through CMHC. And the agreement was signed by the former Liberal government of the province of Nova Scotia for the people of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, that agreement only allowed the money to come down from Ottawa to be channeled into this bucket, and that money only to be spent on maintaining the existing structure for renovations and repairs. There was never any new money in approximately 10 years, with the exception of the Middleton Housing Project. For 10 years that has gone into this province on the issue of housing. Now, we have a social responsibility here of government to provide public housing for those citizens. Here in this particular area, Mr. Speaker, in the metropolitan area that I'm speaking about, there are people who can't afford to pay the rent because the vacancy rate is somewhere around 2.9%, maybe even lower, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that with vacancy rates that low, it's impossible to get a shelter that one can afford. Now, I know we will have the opportunity to speak on this issue when budget deliberations come up, but I think it's absolutely shameful that both political parties, the Liberals and the Tories, could do absolutely nothing to provide increased housing for those people who are in need. And I'm talking about seniors housing. I'm talking about healthy housing for those individuals who have environmental illness. I'm talking about accessible housing units available to persons with disabilities. I'm talking about housing that's made available to people who are on low income. The modest housing program, Mr. Speaker, for example, is something that many Nova Scotians could take advantage of. It will allow them to obtain a mortgage of no more than $70,000, but nonetheless, it gives them the opportunity to get into a housing development of their own, and this government doesn't advertise that program. This government does not provide a brochure. This government does not tell Nova Scotians that it has access to this program. So, Mr. Speaker, in wrapping up, I would say that there's an awful long way to go, and no one ought to pump their chest, particularly the Liberals and the Tories, on their commitment to public housing in the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, it is non-existent. Thank you.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess before I turn my attention to where our attention should be turned today, and that's towards the government, this government, for the past 4 years that has failed to do anything about housing, let me correct my honourable friend on just a few points, who seems to have taken the opportunity to try and, blame the Liberals for everything, which is what that less than honourable group over there has been doing for the last 4 years. But, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts. Let's make it perfectly clear that there has been 11.2...
Order, please. Order, please. Honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Personal privilege. I think I just heard the honourable member refer to members of this caucus as a less than honourable group, Mr. Speaker, and I think that that is very unbecoming for a member in this chamber to verbalize here on the floor of the House, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask that you look into that and that member retract that statement.
Thank you. Order, please. I don't think I really have to take a lot of time to look into what the honourable member would know that all members in this House are honourable, and I'd ask the honourable member to retract that statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I retract it immediately, and I thank the honourable member for bringing it to my attention. I misspoke, and I apologize for that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sometimes your tongue just loses control. I'll be the first to admit, and it can happen from time to time. It's happened to me, and I know it's happened to the honourable members across the way as well, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure it'll happen to them again, especially to the members of the backbench. But, Mr. Speaker, may I say, as I was pointing out, as I was saying, if the Minister of Natural Resources is perfect, then, that's fine, but I'm not, Mr. Speaker, and I admit my mistakes. As I said, I'm pointing out that what the honourable member from the NDP was saying by trying to blame the Liberals for everything is the fact is that the federal government is increasing their funding by $11.2 million. So they put more money into it. Now, how can you argue with that? It's in black and white. It's increased by $11.2 million. So the province is the one that's cutting the funding, not the federal government, the province.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And I did have the opportunity to sit here for however long it was. Seemed like an eternity to listen to the honourable member, but I did listen. And I would expect the same, because the facts speak for themselves. The federal government gave $11.2 million more. The provincial government cut its funding. That is as simple and as clear as you can possibly get. So what happened is that you have $9 million, Mr. Speaker, that's not being used for housing. Now, let me tell you, in my own riding, and every member in this House knows, across this province, there's not a day that goes by, not a month that goes by, that the members of this House don't get requests about housing. I dare say that I could look at any member in this chamber right now, and every one of them, within the last week or so, has had a request to provide affordable housing in their riding. I hear no argument on that, Mr. Speaker, so I will assume for the time being that I'm right on that. Now, what happened, Mr. Speaker, what happened is that when this government came to power, never mind the $9 million, we'll get back to that, but when this government came to power, one of the first things that they did was cancel a program called the Winter Works program. It was one of the first moves by this government to kill the Winter Works program. And that Winter Works program, as all members know in this House, was used to a great part by the Housing Department to upkeep, maintain, renovate units across this province. No Winter Works program. The units aren't, no upkeep, no maintenance. They're empty, they're vacant. In every riding across this province, you will find those vacant units, and along with them, you will find waiting lists in those constituencies of people waiting to get into housing. Glace Bay is a perfect example. I can get you the figures. I've told this House before, in many a times, about the figures of waiting lists, that if they fixed up the units in Glace Bay, for instance, for seniors housing, that there would no longer be a senior on a waiting list if they fixed up the units. Every senior who required housing in Glace Bay would have affordable housing if the Department of Housing had the funding and if it had the responsibility that should be shown by the Minister of Housing in this case to go ahead and fix up those units. Affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, it's not, and I will agree with my colleague from Dartmouth North. Affordable housing is not something that we should be here fighting for. Affordable housing is something that should be provided without question by this government, by a federal government, by a provincial government, no matter what political stripe they are. The people of this province, the people of this country, and yes, the people of other countries deserve affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, for the Metro members in this legislature, they need walk no further than Barrington Street on any day of the week, and they'll see homelessness at its worst. They'll see people who are requiring blankets, who are living in cardboard boxes. Unfortunately, we don't have to step outside of our own province. It's right here in our own backyard. That's in the metro area. It's much more prominent in the metro area than it is, for instance, in rural areas, or for instance, in an urban area such as where I come from. Yeah, it could be, you could call it a hidden problem in those areas. It's not as evident and not as prominent. But here, you'll see it on the streets. So, if you go back to the $9 million. Could $9 million help those people? Well, of course it could. You know, could $1 million help those people? Could $100,000 help those people by providing affordable housing? Of course it could. Back to the seniors and housing units for seniors that are in bad need of upgrading and updating. For instance, in a two-story seniors unit that doesn't have an elevator. Could they use an elevator? Of course they could. They could stay perhaps if they were installed, even if they were lifts or elevators, then maybe seniors could stay in that senior surrounding for a while longer instead of perhaps having to go to a nursing home, which we all know costs many more times than what you pay for a senior's unit to be housed in a nursing home. We know that we're not even going to go there because we know the situation that exists there, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, I'm not expecting, and I don't expect from this government, and I never will expect from this government, to take responsibility for a mistake that they've made. And the mistake that they've made in this instance is not taking that money that has been available, the extra money, the increase in funding that's come from the federal government, and to actually do something that's needed in this province. I don't expect that from this government because I don't expect this government to do what is required for its citizens because we have so many examples over the past in so many areas that I guess it's a sad commentary, but that's where I am right now and where a lot of other Nova Scotians are. They don't expect this government to do the right thing. They expect bad things from this government, and that's exactly what they're being given. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know I don't have that much time left, but, you know, if we're talking about housing, and we're talking about affordable housing and people living on the streets and people not being given the opportunity to live comfortably, safely in this province, we need look no further than the attempt to try and gain, you know, voters in this province with that $155 check that's being passed out. Ask me if there's not something better that could be done with that check. Ask me if housing in this province, the problem with housing, could possibly be eliminated. with that much money. I'll tell you, it would be a good start. Let me put it that way. It would be a great start to try and turn things around on that one issue, that issue of housing in this province, if something was done like that. Now, Mr. Speaker, as this resolution, which is why we call it, as it's stated, that the Conservative government, and let me read this, please. Therefore, be it resolved, it has been the Conservative government that has not provided its fair share of funding for Nova Scotians, not the federal government, which has been the argument that has been put forward by the NDP here in debate of this resolution. We know that it's the Conservative government. We know that that government has been in power long enough that it's time that they stop trying to blame everybody else for their problems and their ineptitude, Mr. Speaker. That's what we know. And that's what Nova Scotians know right now. No longer are they going to accept the excuses that it's some other government, whether it be a Liberal government or, well, I was going to say NDP government, but we know that there will never be an NDP government in Nova Scotia. We know that for certain. Now, Mr. Speaker, if instead the time and effort of the other opposition party was spent on better things and better ideas than trying to blame the Liberals for something they didn't do in the first place, then I think perhaps that's where their efforts should be channeled, Mr. Speaker. As I said, that government, the Conservative government of the day, is the government that has failed Nova Scotians in terms of housing. You need look no further than our own communities when you go home and take a look at how many people are calling your offices and asking for safe, affordable housing in their communities and what you can do for them. What you can do for them is probably tell the Minister of Housing to put that money to good use. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Time resolution 14 has expired. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that completes our business for today.
The honourable government House Leader on tomorrow's hours and business.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 12 noon. The House will sit until 6 p.m. following the daily routine and question period. We'll continue with supply. And on Friday, Mr. Speaker, the House will sit from 9 until such time as we complete 4 hours of estimates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is the House adjourned until tomorrow, the hours of 12 to 6. Is agreed? All those in favour say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The House is adjourned until 12 noon tomorrow. We reached the moment of interruption. This evening's subject for this evening's late debate is submitted by the honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The resolution be it resolved that members of this House commend the community of Hammonds Plains on its commitment to seeing a new school built for the area. Before I get into a great deal of detail, and I know I only have 10 minutes, Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment to explain to members of the House a little bit about the community of Hammonds Plains. It's described by many as the fastest growing community in Atlantic Canada. I suspect that's the case. It's an area that sees a great deal of new residential housing development surrounding lakes and existing road infrastructure. It's a community that dates back probably 150 or 175 years, Mr. Speaker, and it's a community that of young, vibrant families that seek to make sure that their government and the province of Nova Scotia offers the best that it can for their families. And it's a community as well that has a great deal of experience dealing with school issues, and I want to bring to this House's attention the issues that this community has faced. I have a friend of mine who taught school at Hammonds Plains Consolidated School, and that was around the time when they actually consolidated a number of schools in the area to bring them into one school in the mid-1970s. And at that time, when they opened up the Hammonds Plains Consolidated School, almost immediately the school had portables on its site. And continuously from that day until this day, that school has operated almost uninterrupted with portables on its site. Successive governments have been unable to fully address the overcrowding issues that community has faced in the last 3 decades.
They've seen a great deal of effort made, but not enough, really, to make the overcrowding issue go away. In fact, the school now at Hammonds Plains Consolidated School, in order to address some of their issues, they've been forced to take a number of grade levels outside of their traditional elementary school. They are an elementary school for grade primary to 4. The 5s and 6s now go to a junior high, and they have a great deal of issues now with 7 or 9 portables on site and 780 elementary students in one school. Now, I think there's not a member in this House that wouldn't say that's the kind of drastic situation that needs to be addressed. And I'm pleased to say that the community of Upper Hammonds Plains, or of Hammonds Plains, and particularly of Kingswood, are very happy and very satisfied that this government was able to address that concern by announcing a new school and budgeting that school as well. But you know, what really has created a great deal of anxiety amongst the community is this whole thought that maybe somehow, even though this school is announced and the money is in the budget and they have a commitment that's firm and binding, maybe somehow they'll lose that school. And the reason they have that sense of anxiety, Mr. Speaker, is because they've heard this in the past. In fact, this very community had a school announced in their neighborhood. It was going to be built. In fact, the community went out with the work of staff people at the school board and community volunteers and identified a number of sites, only to be having that school taken away at the 11th hour and go to Bedford South.
Shame. By whom?
Purely for political reasons, purely to